So hello everybody, thank you for joining us today for the 12th edition of PhotoIreland Festival. We decided to produce this year an online cooking channel of our own, an unconventional one that inspires ideas and puts forward philosophical or historical considerations. Critical Recipes presents a program of performances and events, taking the model of a cooking show as an inspiration and a departure point to put forward critical discussions. And today we welcome you to the final episode of Critical Recipes, titled Cooking Potato Stories, which is a little different because it's a live event. And so Cooking Potato Stories is a long-term project by artist Ana Núñez Rodríguez. It is a multi-layered translocal story that follows the roots of the potato through the context of Galicia, Colombia, and the Netherlands. And for this edition of PhotoIreland Festival, Ana expands on the current collection of stories to include those from Ireland. She has worked with a number of participants in an exchange of stories, as well as gathering archival images, articles, and written stories from Irish history. And you will hear these stories today. And if you have a story to share yourself or some questions, you can put them in the chat so we can address them later. You can do that at any point during the event. We will ask you to keep your microphones on mute at all times. And just so you know that the event is being recorded and it will be shared on the website of the festival later for those who missed us. And before I hand you over to Ana, I would like to briefly introduce her. Ana is a photographer based between Europe and Latin America. Her work is influenced by how European and Latin American realities converge in her life, interrogating herself about identity and politics and their complexities marked by collective memory and cultural heritage. Ana has a degree in documentary photography and contemporary creation at IDEP Barcelona and postgraduate in photography from the National University of Colombia. She recently graduated with honors from the Master in Photography and Society at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in The Hague. So Ana, I'm going to hand it over to you now. And as I mentioned to everybody, if you have any comments or questions, please do put them in the chat room for us to address later.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Yula, for inviting me to take part of this edition of the festival. I'm super happy to contribute with Cooking Potato Stories to the Critical Recipes. And I would like to start by briefly introduce the very special guest we have today with us. First of all, Regina Sexton. Regina is a food and culinary historian and the program manager of the postgraduate diploma in Irish food culture at the University College of Cork. Welcome, Regina. She will share with us her story, Not Boiling the Moon Out of the Potatoes. Welcome and thank you so much for being part of this Cooking Potato Stories Ireland. And we have with us Barney Whelan. Barney will be our narrator of the stories I have harvested during my research in Ireland. And welcome, Barney, and thank you so much for being the voice today of the stories. And of course, we will also host the voices of the people who participate in the open call and contribute with their stories, and I will also would like to thank them. So let's start. So now I'm going to invite you to all pick up a potato, look it into the eyes, and ask yourselves, can you see my screen? Yeah. So what can a potato tell us about ourselves? What does it say about the construction of national identity? What role can new narratives about the potato play in creating expanded social imaginaries? How can translocal stories and food cultures be connected as an inroad to address forgotten colonial legacies in the wider context of political, social, and emotional relationships? Welcome to Cooking Potato Stories, a multi-layered translocal stories that follows the roots of the potato. A project that holds different voices, perspectives, and resources around the potato by using visuals like vernacular photography, historical imagery, and my own photographic production, as well as sound and text, to build a polyphonic tale that contributes to develop a new social memory about the potato and that drive us in the complex process of how we construct, understand, and make sense of ourselves individually and as a collective based on the stories we tell each other. Because as the narrator says, we are the stories we tell each other. But there are three types of stories. The ones we tell ourselves about the world, the ones we tell ourselves about others, and the ones we tell ourselves about ourselves. They don't sense reality per se, but the perception of reality. And by changing perception, we change. And by changing ourselves in some way, reality also changes. Because we are moved by stories, not by ideas. Each society creates its own identity through a process of permanent reconstruction, a process of dynamic configuration in which the set of particular stories revealed to be crucial. We collectively and individually think through stories. Stories function as an important element of how individuals make sense of the world around us and integrate new ideas into our imaginaries. The imaginaries have fantasies, strong emotions, and intense belief systems that configure our own world. Each society develops a particular way of seeing itself and telling itself its history. At the end, we all make sense of our lives through a combination of narratives. But there are certain narratives that dominate over others. Actually, we all live in a continuous fight of narratives. Now that you better understand why stories, you might wonder why potatoes. When I started this project, I was especially interested in the analogy between the potato and myself, moving between Latin America and Europe, both processes characterized by adaptation and acceptance. But with the development of the work, I actually realized that the potato has this ability to connect to the collective consciousness, and it's a really useful way to talk about ourselves. And actually in different contexts. As Julia said, I started by working between Colombia and Spain, where I was based, but then while I was living in the Netherlands and studying, I also worked with potato there, and now I have the chance to work here. Because actually the potato packs a whole universe of symbols on migration, identity, domination, colonialism, and social differentiation that let us talk about something else rather than potatoes. And also, like, after all, like as Rebecca claims, when you actually say potato, the response is often an autobiography. So today I'm gonna share with you different stories that are directly or indirectly connected to potatoes in Ireland. The stories you are going to listen have been collected through open calls and interviews, and also like based on my own research. And accompanying the other stories, you will see some photographs from my series Cooking Potato Stories, as well as a selection of new images and taken and collected especially for this occasion. So now I welcome Barney to start with the harvesting of stories.
Thank you, Anna. Festival customs, Hallow Eve. This is from a manuscript from the National Folklore Collection, and the informant was Patrick Smith. When the people are peeling the potatoes for the Colcannon, they peel one potato without breaking the skin. Then they hang it up, and the first man who comes into the house is supposed to be married to the eldest daughter in the house. Lazy bed. Irish farmers utilized an ancient lazy bed planting technique, also used by the Incas. Using a simple spade, they first marked long parallel lines in the soil about 4 feet apart throughout the entire plot. In between the lines, they piled a mixture of manure and crushed seashells, and then turned over the surrounding sod onto this, leaving the grass turned upside down. Seed potatoes were inserted in between the overturned end and the layer of fertilizer, then buried with dirt dug up along the marked lines. The potato bed was thus raised about a foot off the surrounding ground, with good drainage provided by the newly dug parallel trenches. A recipe for Colcannon, and this comes from Cassell's Dictionary of Cookery, which was published in London in 1875. Colcannon: boil separately equal weights of young cabbage, savoy or spinach, and potatoes. Chop the greens and mash the potatoes, and mix them well together with a little pepper and salt, as well as 1 ounce of butter to 1 pound of the mixed vegetables. Heat the mixture over the fire for a few minutes, stirring it all the time, and then press it into a hot, well-buttered mold. You can then turn out and serve, or press it after mixing again into a well-buttered mold and put it in the oven for half an hour. Turn it out and serve. Cold vegetable may be warmed up in this way, probably cost 6p for pint mold, sufficient for 3 or 4 persons. Potato gun. This is from the National Folklore Collection, and the collector was Tom Foley. Another toy I make at home is a potato gun, and this is how I make it. First, I get the quill of a goose, called the barrel, and a stick called the ramrod. Then I slice a potato and drive the quill down through it, and a piece of the potato will remain stuck in the quill. Then I stick the other end of the quill down through the potato, and a piece of the potato will be in the 2 ends of the quill then. Then I stick the ramrod through one end, and that drives one of the pieces of potato, and it hits the other piece and drives it off with a sound. The ramrod must be shorter than the quill so that it will not drive out the 2 pieces at the same time. When I'm putting in the pieces of potato, it's called loading the barrel. A sling is made in the following way. First, I get a piece of leather and 2 pieces of cord. I made 2 holes in the leather and put the cords into the holes and tie them. I then put a stone in the leather and swing the cords and letting go of one of them, and the stone will fly a good distance away. Beauties: black champion, black potato, black skerry, blight resistor, bloomers, Bothwell, buffs, champion, Earl of Essex, farmers, flower ball, garden filler, gawkies, green champion, Haddingtons, Irish chieftain, Irish queen, lumper, Mill Street hero, peerless, red cups, rocks, sack filler, scary blue, scary champion, snowdrop, the baron, thome black, thomes, Yankee baby. This is a list of potato varieties which were of historical interest in Ireland. So now we have a recording produced by Katie Walsh about her identity attached to potatoes across the Irish Sea.
At the ripe old age of 23, I set across the Irish Sea. Never did I expect my life in England would revolve around potatoes just so much. Daily potato jokes, daily potato jibes. Sure, I love potatoes just as much as the next person. You don't have to ridicule me for it every single day of my life here. But the thing is, I really love potatoes. And at first, I shied away from it. I didn't let into their potato jokes, but then I reclaimed it as part of my identity, as part of my Irish immigrant identity across the Irish Sea. When they'd ask me, about potatoes and what were my favorite ones, I would start listing off as many types of potatoes as I could possibly think of. Getting hungry right now. Hasselback potatoes, boiled potatoes, potato soup, potato salad, baked potatoes, dauphinoise potatoes, cheesy potatoes, garlic potatoes, chips, mashed potatoes. Did I say that already? It became part of my daily identity across the Irish Sea.
Diaspora. The Greek name diaspora derives from the verb diaspirine, a compound of dia, over or through, and spirine, to scatter or sow. The word emerged from the Proto-Indo-European root spra, SPR, which can be found today in such English words as spore, sperm, spread, and dispersed. In all of its various uses, diaspora has something to do with scattering and dispersal. To the ancient Greeks, diaspora seemed to have signified mainly a process of destruction. Humans have been migrating as individuals and in groups for as long as the species has existed. Diaspora is not a neutral or passive term. It carries claims about motivation and feelings. So this was an excerpt from Diaspora, a very short introduction, which was published in 2013 by Kevin Kenny. So the next piece is a recording called Irish Potato Candy by Daniel van der Klee.
Irish potato candy is a traditional Philadelphia confectionery that is not Irish and does not contain any potato, but is a cocoa powder and cinnamon covering over a white inside of coconut nougat made to look like a potato. It is an extremely sweet treat, generally made up of some blend of coconut, confectioner's sugar, cinnamon, vanilla, and milk or cream. The treats are about the size of a large marble and are especially popular around St. Patrick's Day. Orion's of Boothwyn, Pennsylvania, makes the largest distribution of Irish potatoes, shipping about 80,000 pounds to major chains and smaller candy stores, mostly in the Philadelphia area. See's Candies, based in South San Francisco, also makes a version using pine nuts as potato eyes. They are showcased as a seasonal product by Acme Markets. Many people believe that the Irish potato was created as a commemoration of the Irish potato famine.
The Progress of Starvation. This comes from the Illustrated London News, published on the 6th of February, 1847, and can be found in Ireland's Great Hunger Museum database. The following is a portion of a letter addressed to the committee in London by a gentleman whom the British Association for the Relief of Distress in Ireland and Scotland has recently sent to Ireland. It gives a most lamentable account of the distress now existing in the country. A person named Thomas Miller from Ring, a place on the extreme coast, opposite Cable Island, came with his wife to Youghal, where they both offered for sale at the apothecary's shop the dead body of a male child aged 7 years. The authorities were informed of the circumstance and the parties were arrested. Upon being interrogated, they coolly acknowledged that this child was a nephew of theirs who had died at their house. And they brought him to the doctors to get something for the body that would keep the like in themselves and their children. The description they gave of their suffering was frightful in the extreme. On more than one occasion, they had determined to kill and eat the cat only they feared it would poison them. The verdict in the case of the child was death by starvation. The next piece is from Robert White's diary, The Journey of an Irish Coffin Ship, 1847, Saturday the 5th of June. As the passengers had a great inclination to infringe upon the afterdeck, the captain drew a line, and the penalty for crossing was the stoppage of a day's water. I observed the sea to be crowded with myriads of slimy-looking objects, which the sailors called slobs. They varied in size, form, and colour, some of them resembling a lemon cut in half. How beautiful also was the luminous appearance of the water at night, which I delighted to watch as we glided through the liquid fire. Sunday the 13th of June. The reports from the hold become very alarming, and the mistress was occupied all day attending the numerous calls upon her. She already regretted having come on the voyage, but her kind heart did not allow her to consult her case. Where she appeared upon deck, she was beset by a crowd of poor creatures, each having some request to make, often of a most inconsiderate kind, and few of which it was in her power to comply with. The day was cold and cheerless, and I occupied myself reading in the cabin. Saturday 19th. A shark followed us all day, and the mate said it was a certain forerunner of death. The cabin was like an apothecary's shop, and the mistress a perfect slave. I endeavoured to render her every assistance in my power. The mate also was indefatigable in his exertions to alleviate the miserable lot of our helpless human cargo. Not having seen the stowaway on deck for some time, upon inquiring after him, I learned that he was amongst the sick and very bad, but he was kindly attended by the young man from the County Clare, who devoted himself to attending the afflicted, some of whom the members of their own families neglected to take care of. The fatal collision on the Mersey. This is published in the Pictorial Times on the 6th of June, 1846, and it can be found in Ireland's Great Hunger Museum database. We have already given some particulars relative to the late fatal collision on the Mersey, to which we now append the verdict of the jury and a sketch from nature of a group of Irish emigrants, such as might be seen on the deck of the ill-fated ship before the accident. Captain Thompson, the commander of the Sea Nymph, it was a steamer, one of the vessels which unfortunately has been in collision, gives the following particulars. The Sea Nymph, which trades between Liverpool and Newry, was proceeding her outward passage to the latter port when, at about 11 o'clock, just as she was off New Brighton, a steamer was seen coming up, which afterwards proved to be the Rambler steamer. It was coming from Sligo. Unfortunately, a most disastrous collision took place between the two vessels, and the starboard bow of the Sea Nymph struck the larboard bow of the Rambler, scraping on towards the paddle, and carried away her stem. The Rambler was run on shore near the Rock, and Captain Thompson, having ascertained that she was for some time safe from sinking, brought his vessel into the Clarence dock and discharged his cargo, which has now not, we are informed, any material injury, though the damage done to the vessel is great. And it is said that her not sinking is owing entirely to her watertight compartments. It's believed that upwards of 20 lives were lost, many others more or less injured, some of them if not fatally. On going on board the Rambler, says an eyewitness, which I did by entering through the chasm made through her larboard side into the steerage, a most extraordinary sight presented itself. Part of the flooring of the quarterdeck was smashed through, and the remainder a confused mass of smashed tables, forms, and boxes, some flaming in the water which had filled this part of the vessel. The scene on deck was still more horrifying. The whole, both fore and abaft the funnel, being covered with dead pigs, part crushed to death, and another portion of which seemed to have been stabbed. The whole saturated in the blood. The most awful sight, however, was the bows at the vessel, which were completely bedabbled with human blood and strewed with crushed salmon, broken boxes, cordage, and the fragments of the windlass. From this part of the vessel, 13 human beings had been extricated, some with broken arms or dissevered legs, all dead, and so crushed as to be beyond recognition. One poor woman with her infant child was taken up from underneath the broken windlass, the iron spindle of which had fallen on her head and smashed it completely. Indeed, a portion of her brains were seen to be adhering to this iron spindle. When taken up, her infant had a fast hold of the nipple of the poor mother's breast. 13 poor unfortunates now lie in the magazine's life boathouse for recognition, which in many cases, from the crushed state of their bodies and features, appears to us to be very improbable. We were informed that on the bodies being searched by the constable of Wallasey, Mr. Scambler, not a coin of any kind was found upon the whole. We believe that nearly all the persons on board the Rambler were Irish people intending to emigrate to America. So the next piece is a recording by Catherine Crowley called Granny's Mash.
My grandmother glanced at her wrist, though her inner clock knew it was time to fill the silver pot with spuds. Vishire con na prati adlana. She washed and peeled, then pulled the lighter's trigger. A lilac flame appeared in one click. I listened to the purring of gas, the lid drumming as water bubbled and boiled. Steamed up glasses defogged with a wipe on cotton apron as Grandad arrived for mash made thick and creamy with milk and golden butter. Simple country rituals that tasted like cozy safety.
The Landlord. This is a manuscript from the National Folklore Collection, and the collector was Thomas Lane. Long ago, every district had its landlord to whom every tenant paid the rent. And this district used to pay enormous rents to the landlord, who used to spend most of his time in England. He used to come over for a while every year, collect the rents from his tenants, and when it was all collected, he'd go back to England and spend all the money. If he thought a tenant was getting on too well, he would raise the rent. Sometimes poor tenants had to pay tithes to the landlord. If they had 10 bullocks, they had to give one of them to the landlord. If they didn't do this, the landlord would come and tell them to get out of the house. If they refused to go, he would bring soldiers and evict them. Tables, beds, and all the contents of the house would be flung out the windows and very often broken. If the landlord wanted a house for a friend, he would evict one of his tenants. Famine Pot. This is a manuscript from the National Folklore Collection. It was told by Tom Fay to Micheál Ó Gabhra. The famine pot in which Indian meal was boiled for the people in the famine times is now lying in Tom Fay's yard. He, Fay, said that in the famine times, this pot was hung up in the market square. Twice every week, this pot was filled with water and Indian porridge was made for the people. When the porridge was done, that was ready, each person brought his little can to be filled with porridge. And there was always 2 people engaged in measuring out the porridge. And their names were John Darling and his wife. Tom Fay bought the pot at an auction. So next is an excerpt from a recording on childhood memories. The full story will be available on SoundCloud, and this is Barbara O'Mara.
I remember those golden days of summers long since past, when everything in our lives seemed wondrous and charming. Every year for our summer holidays, our family, city dwellers, my brother and sister and my parents, would take the arduous 6-hour drive to County Kerry to stay in a holiday cottage on a working farm. For us children, it was an enchanting fortnight, with newly born greyhound pups, herding cows for milking time every morning and evening, tractor trips to the creamery with us sitting on the back of the trailer beside the silver milk churns, dangling our legs over the side. My brother was allowed to drive the tractor and help out with the harvesting of crops in late summer. The matriarch of the farmhouse, a tiny, bird-like woman, would greet us with her tightly curled hair and clean apron. She would drop over rounds of oven-baked bread, pats of creamery butter, and fresh hen or duck's eggs. Every day that we were not picnicking at the beach at Bannastrand, I would help out in the kitchen as she prepared the lunchtime meal for the working men of the farm and the visiting seasonal casual labourers who were helping out at harvest time.
Marks on the colonisation of Irish soil. And this comes from Eamon Slater, the Department of Sociology, Maynooth University. On December 16th, 1867, in a public lecture, Marx was reported to have made an extraordinary assertion with regard to how the Irish famine was caused by soil exhaustion, and even more significantly, that the soil exhaustion was itself determined by British colonial domination of Ireland. To quote, the potato blight resulted from soil exhaustion. It was a product of British rule. Although this is probably a rough summary of what Marx actually stated at the end of the speech on the Irish question, it is still a provocative assertion that associated soil exhaustion with British colonial misrule. In a talk Marx gave an in-depth dialectical analysis of British colonialization of Ireland. And in a very innovative way, he suggested that colonial Ireland was not an unchanging condition of existence, but an ever-evolving process of domination. Accordingly, this process of colonialism was constantly passing through phases of evolution, ever changing its strategies of oppression. But as these concrete forms of repression were constantly emerging, the essential underlying process of colonial domination continued. The conquerors are always inventing new, up-to-date methods of oppression. Potatoes on Mars, and this is based on a conversation between Anna and Maria Elena Lalata, the media and communications specialist as the International Potato Center, or CIP. Potatoes on Mars was a collaborative research project between the CIP NASA, and the University of Engineering and Technology, UTEC, in Lima, Peru. NASA apparently investigates products that may be produced on Mars in the future, nutritionally rich and adaptable to the conditions of the planet. In the midst of this research, they determined the potato as one of the possible products. Furthermore, it was identified that in the Atacama Desert in Peru, the soil conditions were very similar to those of Mars. In addition, CIP is the custodian of the gene bank that hosts the world's largest quantity of genetic potato varieties. All of these factors conditioned that Peru ended up being the ideal place to develop the project. So NASA designated one of its scientists of Peruvian origin to start the project. In the first phase, trips were made to the Atacama Desert and soil samples were taken and transported to the CIP facilities, where potatoes were grown in greenhouses using that soil. And this soil had extremely high levels of salinity. The next step was to identify the potato varieties within the germplasm bank that could be highly resistant to these soil conditions. And after carrying out different experiments for more than 100 varieties, this then was lowered to 60 possible species. And in the end, 4 were isolated as the strongest and most resistant. In the second stage, UTEC developed a prototype CubeSat, where in addition to simulating the ground conditions, they also simulated atmospheric conditions on Mars. The potato plant was placed inside this device, and after a while, the plant germinated, so the results were deemed satisfactory. It was demonstrated that these potato varieties are highly resistant to soils with a high level of salinity and extreme conditions. But this discovery might be useful not only for a project on Mars, but also here on Earth, where we have extreme conditions in some parts of the world. Once we analyze that these plants can be grown in these conditions, we apply the results to other extreme terrains, for example, as a consequence of climate change or natural disasters. Beyond this project and the media impact of this research on Mars, our vision as a scientific institution is to analyze how these potato varieties can grow in difficult terrain and how this can be applied to alleviate hunger on Earth. And this has always been the mission of the potato. So folks, that's my lot for this evening. And next up, to talk to us about not boiling the moon out of the potatoes, we have the veritable Irish superstar of food history in Ireland, Regina Sexton.
Thank you very much, Barney. And thank you very much as well, Anna. Just before I start, I suppose just to give you a brief, I suppose just detail as to how I became involved in the project. I heard about Anna's request for looking for potato stories, and that drew me and brought me to her bank of photographs, which, as you will have seen some of them, they are aesthetically very beautiful, to say the least. And they're also, I suppose, extremely dense and provocative. But I thought within that density, there was also quite striking simplicity that communicated, even at a raw level, which will kind of tie in with what I want to talk about today. People and potatoes, and then people with their potatoes. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and we'll get started here. So as you will have heard at the top, I'm a food and culinary historian at University College Cork, where I look after the postgraduate diploma in Irish food culture. In fact, Barney is one of our past students. But today I'm going to be, I suppose, kind of a historian, but I'm also going to be a historian, because I suppose when I heard about Anna's project, I thought in my head, what would she creatively produce on hearing the story of the potatoes in the moon? And she produced some really striking and very moving pieces, which in fact have, I suppose, encouraged me to think about my own practice and to reflect on what I practice and what I do. So, and here she is amongst all the potatoes and so on. And as you'll have seen from the presentation so far, it's turned into just, I suppose, a really striking portfolio of images and story and sound of potatoes. My story of potatoes is now over maybe 23 years old. And 23 years ago, I published this book. It's a very short book aimed at a very general audience. As I say, published in the late 1990s, when the idea of Irish food having a history was almost looked upon as being an oxymoron. In the potato chapter, I referenced a method of potato cookery practiced by the rural poor from the dates I have in the early to mid 19th century. A handful of sources from this time detail how potatoes were half cooked for consumption. Parboiling or half roasting rendered a potato that was at once half cooked and half raw, while the inner core was hard to the bite. Potatoes cooked in this way were called potatoes with the moon, colonial, or potatoes with the bone. And you can see here, after hearing the story, Anna came up with this really fantastic illustration of the potatoes with the moon. As you can see, the inner bit of the flesh here is cooked. The inner part is parboiled or raw or partly raw. And also note this little halo going around the moon part as well. So one of the first references that I came across to the practice was from William Wilde, father of Oscar Wilde. And he describes the practice in some detail in his essay called The Food of the Irish, published by Dublin University Magazine in 1854, which isn't too long after, I suppose, what's taken to be kind of the official end date of the Great Famine, which would have started sort of later in 1845. So here he is in 1854, and he's explaining his kind of understanding of the practice, which you can read on screen here, but we'll go through it kind of quite quickly. He says, the heart of the potato was allowed, by checking the boiling at a particular point, to remain parboiled, hard and waxy, which actually is also of note because the Irish palate was for floury, mealy potatoes rather than waxy ones. Depends on the variety as well, of course. So when the rest of the potato had been masticated in the usual way, this hard lump about the size of a walnut was bolted, was eaten back, quite quickly. And in this manner, nearly a stone of the root was taken into the stomach of the Irish labourer per diem, per year. And it was grounded on a certain knowledge of physiology. And his kind of, I suppose, rationale here was that the stomach digested the well-boiled, voracious portions of the potato within the space of a few hours. And that having all been disposed of, the half-boiled lumps remained behind, and a second digestion was commenced to assimilate this portion of food and to convert it into nutritious, life-sustaining material. The latter process lasted some hours longer, and thus the craving of hunger was warded off for 5 or 6 hours after the original meal. And he goes on with a note to explain the term Anchialach, the moon. He added, when a half-boiled potato is cut, The sections exhibit a central disc with a halo around it like the moon. English visitors have been puzzled by hearing our servants reprimanded for not boiling the moon out of the potato. So I suppose with this reference, the sort of the easy thing to do would be to examine the sort of the reference from the perspective of kind of the idea or the concept of the raw and the cooked, nature, culture, and all in between, sort of in the fashion of anthropologist Levi-Strauss, even though his theories would be in some ways kind of problematic at this point in time. And what I put on screen here for you is, and it's going to follow with another slide now, is another way of cooking potatoes. And this is a potato to cook. This is a recipe to cook a potato pie, which is taken from the handwritten recipe collection of Dorothy Parsons, dated to 1666. Dorothy was born in Burghcastle in County Offaly, but in all likelihood, the recipe and her recipe book was written in England because she married there and so on into another Parsons family. But this is interesting because it's the first recipe that I'm familiar with that has a potato link to Ireland, which is quite significant in terms of cultural transfer and so on. And then when you look at other recipes here, when you go into the 18th century, for example, when handwritten Irish recipes come online in greater volume, and I would have spent some time back in 2016 looking at these collections, you'll see very often that there's recipes almost routinely in the collections. These are the collections of the elite and the wealthy classes for a dish called potato pudding. So I was intrigued by this pudding, and of course I made it just to see what it was like, because if you look at the recipes, they're based on potatoes, the carbohydrate basis potato, but they're also really rich with the addition of things like cream and eggs and butter, spices, alcohol, and sometimes dried fruit. So I've made some of these recipes, and I suppose just to tell you that the potato puddings from these recipes, they all work actually. Well, the ones I've tried work, and they taste really well. They're actually quite beautiful to taste. And what they remind me of actually are kind of baked cheesecakes. The point here, though, and relevant to, I suppose, today and the potatoes with the moon, is that amongst these groups and in these recipes and in the finished product, the potato itself is almost like a hidden ingredient. It's secret, and if you didn't know it was there, you'd be hard pressed to, I suppose, guess what the base ingredient is. And that, I suppose, for me, is the distance of the raw and the cooked part of the story to some extent. But I suppose the other thing is in relation to this analysis from the kind of the idea of raw and cooked nature and nature and culture. I suppose the other, moving away from that and going back to my role as historian, I was also, I suppose, a bit, as the years went by and I became more mature in looking at sources and so on, I was a bit wary of William Wilde's account and tempted to, I suppose, analyze it from the perspective of the writer, the audience, and the fact that it was the sole existing quotation that I had. And I suppose I was also somewhat suspect and just thinking about the comedic value that was implied by the English visitor meeting pitiful Irish cookery. And of course, this would hold a certain appeal for the readership of Wilde's work. And this, in fact, is a motif that carries through to America in the later 19th century, when scenes play out the cooking, and these are quite common, scenes play out the cookery blunders and meal mishaps of poor and untrained Irish cooking girls in the kitchens of their urban middle-class employers. So this was interesting for me to think about in the context of another reference I've come across in this book called Breakfast, Dinner and Tea published in America in 1859, which almost is like an American recreation of William Wilde's scene of the servants in Ireland and their inability or not willingness to cook the moon out of the potatoes. So this book takes as its explanation for the custom in America, potatoes with the moon, what does that mean? And this publication takes the work of Dr. James Johnson, who toured in Ireland some years before. And he would have described, as he says here, we all have wondered why our Irish servants persist in bringing half-boiled potatoes to the table, notwithstanding our repeated orders to the contrary. And then it goes on to kind of pin back to the information of James Johnson, referencing his tour in Ireland, and he discovered that it was almost a universal custom among the poor of that country to only half boil their potatoes, leaving the centre so hard that it is called the bone in the potato. And the custom has so much reconciled the poor Irishman's stomach to this food that even the children complain if they don't find a bone in their potato, which I think is quite interesting. And his quotation is a bit longer than that as well. But three references from Breakfast, Dinner and Tea and from James Johnson and William Wilde do not a custom make, and we should be careful in that respect. So with some more searching, I found other references, two earlier accounts to half cooking potatoes, one from the surveyor and land agent Edward Wakefield's An Account of Ireland Statistical and Political, published in 1812, and another from Thomas Reid, a Tyrone-born naval surgeon and author of Travels in Ireland in the year 1822. Going back to Wakefield, in an entry, a record entry in his work for the 6th of July, he describes cooking the potatoes and leaving the bone in as well. And this date I find to be significant for July, is significant in the context of the dietary patterns of the rural poor in the early decades of the 19th century. July is the hungry gap month, when the potatoes were scarce, the old stocks were being used up from the previous harvest, and they were nearing exhaustion, and the new crop had yet to be harvested. Now that's a bit of a kind of a simplistic description of it, because it depends on the varieties and differences in cultivation and advances in potato varieties and so on. But for the most part, this month of July, which we're just coming out of, was the month of hunger and distress, when the market value of potatoes were high and their purchase was beyond the means of many. That the poor and the destitute should stretch their stocks of potatoes and cook in this fashion to keep hunger away makes very good sense in the context of seasonal collapse of the diet of the poor, the destitute, and those farm labourers that were left without work outside the harvest periods. And I want to bring in another type of image for you, and this is a painting by an artist called Francis Topham, called Irish Peasants in a Cottage from 1844. And that date in itself is significant because it's the year before the arrival of the Blight in 1845. Now, this illustration appeared for the first time in a book by my friend Claudia Kinmonth called Irish Country Furniture, not to be confused with her more recent publication from November of last year. But I put this one in because I suppose it communicates aspects of the dietary patterns, the impoverishment, the debasement, and the pitiful scenes. And you can see here this couple with possibly another man here, as you can see in what is possibly a bed offshoot that she explains. And there is little of anything in their house or hovel. Now, there are hens over here as well, as you can see here, but all they have is their pot for boiling the potatoes, the basket that we've seen already for draining the potatoes. These are the potatoes, and the noggin filled with the liquid accompaniment in which they will dip the potatoes for eating. And Claudia says that this is the earliest visual representation of the ritual of potato eating in these immediate pre-famine years, even though the description itself is described in literary texts before this date. But I suppose, apart from all the business of history and maintaining a kind of an objective and critical relationship with the sources that we have met, this insight into the impoverished food habits of the poor in pre-famine Ireland has stayed with me since the publication of that book, A Little History of Irish Food, in 1998. And I suppose for lots of us, in reading those accounts, a potato with a moon holds a certain emotional, if not voyeuristic, fascination that might be extended also to cooking, to see what these potatoes with the moon might be and what they might taste like, and particularly from the mouth feel. What I also did for today was I contacted another friend of mine called Finn Dwyer. And Finn is a historian who has probably one of the best podcasts of Irish history, called An Irish History Podcast. And I think it was a year, possibly a year and a half ago, what Finn did was he put himself on the diet of pre-famine Ireland for a few days, whereby he consumed large volumes of potatoes in line with the volumes and the quantities that you will find referenced in various different sources from the mid to late 19th century, where any one single person could be consuming up to 14 pounds of potatoes. It varied by age, by gender, and by the time of the year as well. And I asked him, because he put himself through this, I asked him just to give me an account of this eating regime of potatoes. So he says, a 19th century diet based around large volumes, in this case boiled potatoes, is overwhelmingly bland, which we would kind of know anyway from dietary descriptions of the period. And he says, although by modern standards, I regularly eat large numbers of potatoes, maybe 3 to 5 a day, this in no way prepared me for an exclusively potato-based diet. And remember, he's eating cooked potatoes, not the ones with the moon now for the moment anyway. The texture of the potato, he says, became far more noticeable and, to my surprise, unpleasant, even when accompanied by buttermilk or dilsk, a type of seaweed or pepper, which you find reference to. I often found it difficult to eat more than a dozen or so throughout the day. And he says, while filling, I also found eating them far more time-consuming than the mere balanced meal when they're accompanied by other vegetables and meat or fish. And he says the prospect of eating 3 dozen or more of them, while far beyond my ability, would have required far more time than my normal meals would have taken to prepare and to consume. So from Finn's example, I had to go away and do the potatoes in the moon for myself and see, to carry on the sort of the voyeurist gaze, I suppose, and to see what they tasted like with the moon in them. So these, it's not a great image, but these are my potatoes with the moon. And you can see I've taken a bit out of them there. And what I did was I actually ate them, the moon with soft flesh together, and that went down okay. And then, like the descriptions of William Wilde, I just took off all the soft bit and I was left with the moon, and I tried to eat that as well. And I have to say it was edible, and if I can describe what it was like, the taste is kind of like the smell you get if you slice a raw potato and smell it. It smells, to me anyway, it smells fairly earthy and floury and a small bit of freshness. And that smell was actually communicated in the taste. But the thing I didn't expect was the noise when you eat these moons. The noise that goes from your mouth cavity directly to your ear is quite extraordinary. And noticeable and very obvious and very evident. So I think if I was eating the moons as described by William Wilde, that would be my lasting memory and impression, or something that stayed with me. All of this, though, I suppose, has kind of come back somewhat to me, and I've started thinking about this in different ways. And I said at the top that these potatoes with the moon have stayed with me for emotional reasons, I suppose, really. But I'm also thinking that this practice of even now today of showing you this, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with it, and it's kind of a bit unsettling for me to some extent when you consider the context and so on. And I suppose what I also thought about is that we're in the developed world, we're in the global north, and we're all somewhat food crazed. Food is everywhere and it's accessible half the time, all the time. So this idea of half cooking potatoes and eating little else seems unthinkable and as far away from us as the moon itself. This distance and difference in realities and worldviews gives space to indulge fascination. And that's what I was saying. At some level, I find this captivation in myself to be, for me, at best uncomfortable and at worst somewhat distasteful. And this links for me to the kind of the current fetishization of food in the past, which often seems to exist without purpose or reason, a kind of an indulgence of the global north, where we're well fed and sometimes anxious in our well-feeding. I carried on with the potatoes and I didn't eat all of them. And I suppose this was something that was surprising. When I left the potatoes after cooking them and eating bits of them, you can see my bits that were eaten. This is the bit I spat out because I just couldn't eat anymore. But what I noticed was that the potatoes started to discolor, which would happen anyway with cooked food if it was left to the air. But what was extraordinary was that the longer I left them, the darker the moon became. So now you had black moons in the potato, which I found really surprising, and I didn't expect this to happen. Which brings us back to the whole kind of idea of this idea of something, particularly food, that's raw, that will rot, and that's rotten. And the image on screen at the moment is my black moons in the cooked potato, juxtaposed with these blight-infected potatoes, infected with potato blight, Pythophthora infestans. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to think myself in terms of history and story, because they are related, and to think about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, particularly in the context of potatoes with the moon, or potatoes with the bone. And I think I'm very grateful that I've met Anna, that because she's brought me to this kind of thinking, alongside her own reflections and her own project work as well. So that's the potatoes and the moon. I've spoken for quite a while now, so I'll stop and hand back to the other superstar of narration, Barney Whelan.
Yeah, thank you so much, Regina, for sharing this amazing story. I think you have so nicely combined this historical material and like use the potato to connect to this human side of history. And I think like once again, like potato demonstrate how it really connects to different topics and how it can be like connect us to the past, the present, and even the future. I really, really thank you for your contribution. It was really nice to work with you. And I hope you all enjoyed this harvesting of stories around the potato and this new contribution of counter narratives around it to continue reframing together the social memory of it. And I would like to end by saying, like, today a region does not necessarily has to be something defined politically or geographically, but a specific space for common stories and experiences, and a state of mind rather than a spot in the map. So if finding a place, I think it means find a place in a story. And I hope like after listening all those stories, you will question your stories and you will find yours. So if we are moved by a story, let's choose the ones we want to be moved by. And yeah, I also want to remind you, like, you are all invited to contribute with new stories. Like, we will continue harvesting. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna and Barney and Regina. It was absolutely fascinating. And I just, the connections between the history and the personal and the social, yeah, it was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you, Anna, for the super hard work that you've done on the project and for contributing this to our festival as well. It was just brilliant to have this as part of the festival, and yeah, I'm very grateful. Thank you. And as Anna said, the collection of stories continues, and the stories are still being gathered by Anna. In autumn, we'll release a new Cooking Potato Stories, a new sheet publication following the festival and incorporating these new Irish stories. So if you'd like to share your story, do email Anna. I'm going to pop an email into the chat in a second. I just don't want to finish without bringing your attention to just a few links that I'm going to put in the chat just now. The festival website, where you can watch back all the events that we held online. And if you missed any, you can watch them back. I put the link there for the artist talks and the other critical recipes episodes as well. If you enjoyed Anna's story, there's other ones that you might enjoy as well. And we've recently launched also the second issue of Overjournal, and so the pre-orders are in the link as well. And last but not least, I just want to say a very big thank you also to the festival supporters, the Arts Council of Ireland, Dublin City Council Arts Office, the Office of Public Works, Frame Finland, Mondrian Funds, and the Alliance Française in Dublin. And sorry. And yeah, there's been a few comments as well in the chat room just to congratulate Anna, and people are really enjoying your project. So I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody, especially Anna. And yeah, I hope you share your stories with her.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Barney and Regina. Thank you so much.